So AI has made game development honestly as easy as it's been yet. In terms of like when you think about the barrier to entry of things, it is as low as it's ever been, which is great, right? I see this as a great opportunity for more people to get into game development. And for me, who's been using AI and have absolutely no knowledge about coding and been able to make games that I look at and I think are pretty cool, that's been really, really nice. However, although it's great at being able to get into things, I also think that AI makes it very difficult to finish projects. Because when you're using AI to help with development, there's very little friction between having an idea and actually being able to implement it into a game. You can explain a feature, give AI the context, and it can often help you write most of the code. This code might not work necessarily straight away, but with enough back and forth, you'll be able to actually get it to work. But compared to building the entire system from scratch, it can obviously feel incredibly fast. And obviously, the same can have happen outside of programming, right? You can obviously generate concept arts, UI elements, music, sound effects, etc. Means that you can effectively go from a very vague idea to something very playable and very much there and built already. The issue is when adding something feels easy, it becomes very difficult to effectively stop adding new things. Now, I experienced this issue firsthand when making my first game, Scarred Steel. When I discovered the use of Cursor, being able to effectively do entirely done for you coding, that was very freeing. I was able to basically describe the sort of thing I wanted it to make, and Cursor could go ahead and make scripts, edit scripts, etc. And this was brilliant. However, it became very difficult to finish that project. It took me, I think, an additional 2 months or so in order to actually get that project out because the scope of the project went very much out of control. Because when you're working on a creative project, for me personally, I want to make it as cool as possible. I want to be able to add those things that I have ideas for. And with AI being able to help me implement it, it's very freeing, right? I don't need to go through loads of tutorials or whatever. The issue is again, scope control, having to push things back. Like, I remember probably about, I think about 5 days before I was meant to release Scarred Steel, I hadn't even play tested and finished the game myself, right? Which that in itself is an issue because I don't know if actually the players can do it, right? Because I haven't done it myself. And it like literally a lot of it was just instead of focusing on finishing what I had, I wanted to keep adding more because I could. And that's the issue. Now, if I had to create every asset myself, compose every piece of music, and write every system without assistance, I would probably stop and ask myself whether I really needed something before spending days making it, right? But when AI can obviously iterate and produce that first version very quickly, it becomes a very easy why not, right? Why not add this, etc. But eventually, obviously, all those decisions combine to a project that's obviously far more bloated than you really need it to be, right? And the reality is that you still need to test it, you still need to fix those bugs if like what like wherever they are, and most importantly, it needs to be something which actually is released to the public and people can play it and actually enjoy it. And I think that's really the most important thing because AI can honestly make that sort of those stages very difficult. Because if you just end up with a very complicated game with lots of half-baked ideas, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually release a game and for it to have something of an identity. Now, Scarred Steel took me about, I think, like 764 hours or so, right? And ideally, with Primus, I think I'm around 275 hours. And considering I'm looking at being effectively 4 weeks until I release it, obviously it's going to be a lot more efficient in terms of timing. That said, with things like Primus that I'm currently making, I need to I've been so careful of just scope control, of making sure that if I have ideas, I need to separate them into two things. I need to separate them into a must-have and then into a would be cool to have. Because that's the real big thing. If you can iterate it easily, it's tempting to iterate lots without actually being able to properly finish things. And I think it's pretty challenging because when I have ideas which I think are good, the immediate thought is, well, if I can implement this and it makes the game better, then it makes sense. But I think really it is just figuring out what is absolutely necessary for the game. And you can always add more stuff as well. I think for me, it's been looking at going from nothing to a demo and then going from a demo to a full game. And it's just looking at what is absolutely necessary in each of those parts. And for Primus especially, I've deleted so much with like from Primus. I had like dialogue systems between factions and interactions, and I got rid of all of that because for me it just didn't make sense, right? It felt very bloated. It was sort of half done, and I just didn't really make sense of it, so I just got rid of all of it. And Primus feels a lot better now. It feels a lot clearer, and it's just trying to think about that. And for example, like, I mean, for me, I'm modeling Primus somewhat, or at least having inspiration from a game called Darkest Dungeon. And that game in itself is pretty straightforward to some level. Sure, there is obviously a learning aspect to it, but I wouldn't particularly say it's heavily complex, right? You recruit the individuals, you take them into the dungeon, you go through the dungeon, you come out of the dungeon, you level people up and such, and then you go back in. And that's the sort of thing which I think for Primus, obviously it's not exactly like that, but it is the similar mentality which I'm trying to take in with it. Now, looking back at Scarred Steel, I honestly think I could have saved probably hundreds of hours if I had better scope control, possibly more. Right, not because those hours were completely wasted. I obviously learned a lot from them, but honestly, many of them were just like wasted spending time on just creating things that honestly, didn't really need to be needed in the project. And looking at Scarred Steel now, honestly, I feel like it could be polished up a bit more, or at least in comparison to what I'm making now with Primus. So the lesson, honestly, for me is that with like when it comes to AI game development, the scope control is really key. And the lesson, I guess, is that speed creates its own problems. When you can build faster, you also need to become much better at deciding what not to build. But overall, I think AI is incredible for making games. I think it allows people to basically take ideas like that they have for games and iterate them very quickly, or at least start making and seeing progress fairly quickly. Obviously, the main thing is being able to actually finish the games, in which obviously scope control really plays a part. Now, for me at this time recording, I'm just mainly focusing on keeping the scope of my games fairly compact, right? I, on average, want to be spending maybe between 6 to 8 months per game, at the time recording at least. Just because I want to be able to make games, release them, and get them out to the public, get feedback, and move forward with it. And I'm trying to see the games I make as milestones. Scarred Steel taught me, that I could make it happen, that I could make something. Primus is teaching me how to make things ideally look better, right? In terms of just the UI and the HUD and make it feel more polished. And upcoming games, I might look to make a 3D game, which would teach me a bit more about that, and so on and so forth. And I think, again, it's trying to get a feel for when you have ideas. Is it a must have or is it something that would be cool? But overall, that's sort of what I would say. Scope control is really key. With that said, if you have any questions, obviously let me know, but I'll catch you soon.